Hello, today I want to talk about a topic that's been interesting me lately, and that is ability to visualize what we read. And before getting into this, it goes without saying that if you don't visualize what you read, one, you're not alone, and two, there are so many other aspects to appreciate in a story than just the visual components. So there is political intrigue, plot elements, themes, ideas, the emotional experience a character is going through, so many other elements. So it's okay if you're not somebody who visualizes what you read. But I find this topic really interesting because recently I've heard from some friends here on BookTube that say they are not visual readers. And just to give some backstory here, I first fell in love with reading at the end of elementary school, beginning of middle school, and I distinctly remember having the experience of opening a book and feeling so swept away in the story that I felt like I was transported to another realm. And the visual experience of that was an important part of that experience, to the point where I remember when I closed the book, I would have to remind myself, my name is Joanna, this is an object called a book, these are words on a page, because I would be so swept away in my visual experience. And of course, when I talk about visualizing what we read, there are other ways or other sensory experiences I think we can have with reading. So you can imagine sounds and smells and so many other things. But for now, I'm just going to talk about this in terms of visual reading. And I think it's really interesting to hear that different people have different experiences with this. Because fast forward to years later as an adult, when I started reflecting back on this topic, I realized I have had experiences where I've been swept away in the visual sensory experience of a book, but I've also had experiences where I've been really engaged in the themes, ideas, and other aspects that I just mentioned. So I don't think there's one right way to experience a book or anything like that, but it's just interesting to consider the different things that we are attending to when we read. And so I find this interesting because different people, even if you are a visual reader, put a different amount of weight on how important that experience is. So for example, my friend Abby Salter, she mentioned in a couple of videos about how she really wanted to enjoy the book Leviathan Wakes, and she couldn't enjoy it because she had trouble visualizing the world building. And then there's my friend Grace, who recently did a video on how she rates books, and she said in that video that she's not a visual reader. So obviously that's not going to affect the way she rates books. So it's interesting just to look at Abby's experience and how she couldn't enjoy the book because she couldn't visualize it. And then Grace, who doesn't consider the visual component when she's enjoying a book or engaging with the story. Now, personally, I did read Leviathan Wakes and I really enjoyed it and I was able to visualize it, but this brings in another discussion point. I did watch The Expanse show, just the first couple of episodes before reading the book. It was about a year or two before reading the book, but I still don't know how much that maybe affected my ability to visualize what I was reading. I just have no way of knowing for sure. And so I think that's another part to talk about, are adaptations and how much those either help or hinder our experience. So I think I'm going to guess that for visual readers, that can either be complementary to what you're already visualizing, or it can sort of go against or clash with what visual you have in mind when you're reading a story or the idea you have of how a character looks. Whereas for somebody who's not a visual reader, maybe that enhances their experience to see some fan art or to watch an adaptation or play a video game. I'm not sure, but I just think it's an interesting thing to consider, especially when evaluating adaptations and noticing that different people attend to different things when they're reading a book. Now, as a visual reader, I have had the weird ability to turn on and off my ability to visualize what I'm reading, like a light switch. It's very strange. So I've had the experience where I'm kind of reading words on the page and then suddenly I'm able to see what I'm reading. And then sometimes it happens so effortlessly that I'm not thinking about it at all. I mentioned in a recent video that I read The Name of the Wind and The Wise Man's Fear prior to starting a channel. I read those two books back to back. And I mentioned how I kind of tired of both by the end of The Wise Man's Fear. But that character became so vivid to me that I actually had a dream towards the end of The Wise Man's Fear in which I met Gavoth, and he was so vivid to me in my dream. I could see him so clearly in vivid detail. So that was very surreal, and that's just how powerful I think the visual experience can be for me personally. I also want to say as a visual reader that description is another interesting component here, because I think that one, sci-fi and fantasy. I would imagine that there would be a little more emphasis on description given the world building aspect of science fiction and fantasy. Now, not to say that the visual description is the only aspect of world building. There are so many other aspects of world building that have nothing to do with the visual component. But I would think that authors would put more emphasis on that. I'm just guessing. And I also wonder how much authors themselves visualize what they're writing about. So I find that interesting that maybe some of their readers aren't visualizing what they're reading, but the authors are visualizing what they're writing. So that's just something to think about, I think. As a visual reader, I can say this totally depends on the writer, but sometimes for some writers, heavy description does not necessarily lead me to the best visual experience as a reader. Sometimes less is more. It totally depends on the writer. And sometimes I think that the visuals of action scenes can be harder to imagine than others. I think that that's a challenge that a lot of people have when it comes to battle and action scenes. I personally like that in stories usually, but a lot of times when I really love battle scenes, it's when it incorporates other elements in the atmosphere or landscape or sky, just different kinds of variety in my sensory experience of it. But I think when there's a lot of detailed description on somebody hitting another person with a sword, that could take a lot of time to slow down to try to visualize that. So I do wonder if trying to visualize affects pacing or if description affects pacing in any way. Just a thought. One other topic I want to bring up related to this are story worlds, which is a topic that AP Canavan brought up on A Critical Dragon, so definitely check out the video. I'll link it down below. Now, I hope I'm not getting this totally wrong. Check out the video so you can get a more accurate explanation of the difference between setting and story world. But from what I understand from him in that video, the story world not only includes the description of the setting, but also all the elements in the story that are implied or suggested, referenced in the narrative, that then becomes created through our own imaginations as readers. And the interesting thing is, each one of us is going to have a different story world than anyone else because we're kind of filling in the gaps. So that's something else to consider. And he talks about how your story world might be different at one stage in your life when you read a book versus a later stage in your life. So this is how we construct narrative in our own minds. In other words, reading books, it's sort of a reciprocal relationship between what the author is presenting on the page and what you are constructing in your mind as a reader. And I just find that fascinating. So again, this is just a topic I've been finding really interesting recently, and I'd love to hear from you. Are you a visual reader? And if you are, how much weight or emphasis do you put on your ability to visualize what you're reading? And if you're not a visual reader, what are some of the other elements that you find are important for you in order to engage with the story? Thank you so much for watching and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.